Stay connected to your community and save. Just 99 cents a month gets you 3 months of unlimited access to Inforum.com. Visit Inforum.com/subscribe and get your first 3 months of news for only 99 cents a month.
Recently, you might have listened to The Capones of North Dakota on both Back Then with Tracy Briggs or on The Vault. It was a look at the famous gangster and his connections to the upper Midwest. After those stories ran, you surprised me. Hi, this is Tracy Briggs, and welcome to Back Then. The story started small enough. I found a little write-up in a book about a young woman named Stella Hildrey, a teenager in the tiny town of Petersburg, North Dakota, in the 1920s. Word had it that Stella once served Al Capone dinner at her family's cafe. So I figured Stella's story was worth a look on Back Then. So I began to research it. I'd get photos and find verification, etc. But then, as often is the case with these historical stories, I found myself falling down a rabbit hole like Alice herself. But in this case, Wonderland was the newspaper archives, the State Historical Society of North Dakota, the Library of Congress, and conversations in grocery store aisles and over the radio airwaves. That one story about Al Capone soon became 3. During my immersive dive into the rabbit hole, not only did I learn more about Stella waiting on Capone, by the way, he dined on steak, and liked it enough that he gave her a big tip, but I also learned Al's older brother, Vincenzo, was a federal prohibition agent in North Dakota, and Al himself had been frequently spotted in Minnesota Lakes Country, even reportedly calling the drive from Bemidji to Park Rapids his very favorite. After the stories were published, I was surprised by how many of you had your own gangster stories. Now, many of you admitted right away you weren't sure whether the stories were true or not. I heard things like, I once heard that Capone went fishing in the next county over, or my grandpa said he was spotted in a speakeasy north of town. Maybe they're all just rumors repeated enough to feel true. Like a century-old version of the sleepover game Telephone, some of the rumors might have evolved and grown over the years, while the details of others are largely unchanged from the FDR years. The problem is, at this point, we can't really tell which is which. And honestly, does it really matter which are true and which are not? It's just fascinating that so many of us are still so fascinated by gangsters. I had to wonder, what was it about Al Capone in the Midwest that captivated people 100 years ago and still today? After reading the findings from sociologists, psychologists, and historians, you'll see the reasons make a lot of sense. Reason number 1, prohibition was unpopular. While the passage of the Volstead Act creating prohibition received a supermajority in Congress in 1920, in the years to follow, public opinion was definitely not on its side. According to the Literary Digest Prohibition polls, in the early 1920s, just a couple of years after passage, at least 40% of the population wanted to modify prohibition in some way. Some people suggested making wine and beer legal, for example. And every year, the call for a full repeal got louder. By 1932, a reported 74% of the population wanted prohibition to be repealed, gone forever. The glamorization of the mob was actually born during this time. When everyday Americans failed to find liquor legally, they could find it from what was then small criminal groups, even in small states like North Dakota. But those small groups soon solidified into a larger, networked institution of organized criminals, the mob. In an interview with The New Yorker, James Finkenauer, an emeritus professor from Rutgers University and the author of Mafia and Organized Crime, A Beginner's Guide, said because prohibition was so unpopular, the men who stood up to it were heralded as heroes, not criminals. He said, It was the start of their image as people who can thumb their noses at bad laws and at the establishment. Second reason, a depression distraction. Consider the time period when gangster life was really at the center of everybody's attention. The Roaring '20s were fading as the Great Depression took hold. And in the case of the Upper Midwest, drought added to the despair. In the early 1930s, there was a period of severe dust storms that caused major agricultural damage to American and Canadian prairie lands. Life in the dirty 30s was tough for many people in the Dakotas and Minnesota. So imagine the delight when word started to spread that nicely dressed men from the big city were driving through town and spending money without a care in the world. The mobsters seemed bigger than life, untouched by the harsh realities of normal Americans. Reason number 3, help from Hollywood. America got its first pop culture fix of mob life in the 1930s as Hollywood started cranking out gangster flicks starring the likes of Jimmy Cagney and Edward G. Robinson. The gangsters were often portrayed as self-made men. They came from poor immigrant families starting with nothing, but through determination and grit, they became wealthy and powerful men, albeit by illegal means. But as the gangsters went from rags to riches, moviegoers could look at what life could be like if you chose to live outside the confines of normal society. As misguided as it might have been, movie mobsters were seen not as murderers and hoods, but as macho men who charted their own paths. Maybe that was a reassuring message for Midwestern farmers who must, at times, have felt powerless. After all, Mother Nature, with her drought, frost, and pests, might have had more to do with a successful crop than anything within the farmer's control. And what about those Midwestern factory workers who were at the mercy of the time clock and domineering foremen? And mob movies and TV shows really haven't gone away. Think about this, from The Godfather to The Sopranos to Boardwalk Empire, the appeal of mobsters is still very real, nearly 100 years later. Reason number 4, truth can be stranger than fiction. Finally, perhaps the stories about Al Capone in the Dakotas and Minnesota are still being told for a very good reason. They're true. At least some of them are. As I said earlier, I've loved the last couple of weeks of chatting with so many of you about your Al Capone stories. I've received emails and phone calls. I've been stopped in the frozen food section of Hornbachers. And I had so much fun talking to people calling into the Jay Thomas Show in WDAY AM radio. Their stories about gangsters close to home and, of course, Jay's enthusiasm for the subject were infectious. How can I not keep looking into Capone's ties to our region? Now, if you didn't get a chance to read all of the stories, you'll find them linked within this story on Inforum.com. And of course, it is in the podcast at Back Then with Tracy Briggs and also on The Vault. Or you can also watch a compilation video produced by foreign videographer Chris Flynn. You will find that embedded in the story on Inforum. Finally, I'd like to thank all of you for your suggestions and ideas for follow-up stories. I have them all written down. They're in a Google Doc. They're organized and ready for me to tackle at another time. If you did not get a chance to share your stories, rumors, or family history about Capone, or really any gangster from that era of the 20s and 30s, please email them to me at tracy.briggs@formcom.com. I do hope to revisit Capone and his local connections more in the future, so stay tuned for that. Let's just hope I have better luck than Geraldo Rivera. And that is Back Then. I hope you'll catch us again next time.
Get reliable and accurate local news with Inforum.com. Inforum.com is your trusted local news source with journalists dedicated to keeping you informed about what's happening in your community. Visit Inforum.com now.